October 3rd, 1944, Aachen, Germany. Obergefreiter Werner Kraus pressed his back against the shattered remains of a brick storefront, lungs burning, ears still ringing from the artillery barrage that had ended minutes before. American voices echoed through the rubble-choked street, closer now, methodical. He gripped his Karabiner 98K tighter, knuckles white against the walnut stock. 5 rounds left in the internal magazine. He'd already fired twice at shadows moving through the smoke. Then he heard it, a sound that would haunt German soldiers for the rest of the war. Ping. Sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The distinctive ring of an M1 Garand ejecting its empty en-bloc clip. Kraus knew that sound meant the American rifleman 40 meters ahead was reloading. Standard doctrine, drilled into every Wehrmacht soldier since Normandy. When you hear the ping, you charge. The enemy is vulnerable. 3 seconds, maybe 4, before he can load a fresh clip and chamber a round. Kraus burst from cover, crossing the 15 meters of open street in a dead sprint. He raised his Karabiner, finger on the trigger, ready to fire the moment he had a clear shot. But the American didn't fumble with his rifle. He didn't drop to one knee to reload behind cover. He simply raised his M1 Garand, already loaded, and fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first bullet struck the cobblestones at Kraus's feet. The second hit the wall beside him. The third caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him sideways into a doorway. As Kraus collapsed, gasping, blood soaking through his tunic, he realized what had happened. There had been 2 Americans. One fired until his clip ejected. The other, silent and patient, waited for Germans like Kraus to take the bait. The ping wasn't a weakness. It was a trap, and he'd fallen for it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Werner Kraus survived that day in Aachen. American medics treated his wound, and he spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Kansas. In a 1976 interview for a German military history journal, he described that moment as the first time he truly understood that American infantry tactics were more sophisticated than German propaganda had led him to believe. The M1 Garand, he said, wasn't just a rifle. It was a psychological weapon that changed how firefights worked. The hatred German soldiers developed for the M1 Garand didn't emerge from a single source. It was layered, accumulating through countless small defeats, tactical surprises, and the grinding realization that American infantry held a fundamental firepower advantage that German doctrine couldn't counter. That hatred was rooted in something darker than simple fear of enemy weapons. It was the recognition that Germany's military philosophy, built on precision and individual marksmanship, was being overwhelmed by American mass production and firepower doctrine. The Karabiner 98K that Werner Kraus carried represented 70 years of German bolt-action rifle evolution. Its lineage traced back to the Gewehr 1888, through the Gewehr 98 that armed German troops at Verdun, refined into the Karabiner 98K, adopted in 1935. The design philosophy was consistent across all iterations. Accuracy, reliability, and the assumption that a well-trained rifleman firing carefully aimed shots would dominate the battlefield. The Kar-98K's action was a Mauser design, arguably the finest bolt-action system ever engineered. 5 rounds loaded into an internal magazine via stripper clips. A smooth, straight-pull bolt that could be cycled quickly by experienced soldiers. Exceptional accuracy out to 500 meters, adequate accuracy to 800 meters with iron sights. The rifle weighed just under 4 kilograms, balanced beautifully, and could be maintained in brutal conditions with minimal tools. German military doctrine assumed that infantry combat would be decided by marksmanship and fire discipline. Soldiers trained extensively to make every shot count. The standard doctrine emphasized aimed fire at identified targets, conserving ammunition, and achieving kills through superior shooting skill, rather than volume of fire. This philosophy worked brilliantly in the open terrain of Poland and France, where German infantry could engage at range with clear fields of fire. But that doctrine was built on a critical assumption. that most combat would occur at distances beyond 200 meters, where careful aimed fire mattered more than rapid fire. Wehrmacht training manuals from 1939 emphasized that a disciplined rifleman firing 5 well-aimed shots would defeat an enemy firing 15 rounds wildly. The mathematics seemed sound. Accuracy multiplied by fire discipline equaled battlefield superiority. What German planners didn't anticipate was that modern mechanized warfare, especially in the dense terrain of Western Europe's towns and forests, would shift the average engagement distance downward dramatically. By 1944, after-action reports from Normandy showed that most infantry firefights occurred at ranges under 100 meters, often under 50 meters in urban fighting. At those distances, the advantage shifted from precision to firepower. The M1 Garand emerged from a very different military philosophy, one rooted in American industrial thinking and WWI lessons that the US Army interpreted differently than their German counterparts. John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer working at Springfield Armory, spent the 1920s developing what would become the first semi-automatic rifle adopted as a standard infantry weapon by any nation. The Army's requirements were ambitious: a semi-automatic rifle that could fire as fast as the trigger could be pulled, hold at least 8 rounds, maintain accuracy comparable to the bolt-action Springfield 1903, weigh no more than 10 pounds, and prove reliable enough to replace the bolt-action entirely. Most weapons designers considered this combination impossible to achieve at a reasonable cost for mass production. Garand's breakthrough came in his gas operation system. When the rifle fired, some of the propellant gas expanding behind the bullet was tapped through a port in the barrel, driving a piston that cycled the action automatically. The bolt unlocked, the spent cartridge case ejected, a fresh round fed from the magazine, the bolt locked, and the rifle was ready to fire again. All of this happened in a fraction of a second without the shooter needing to manipulate a bolt. The en-bloc clip system that Garand adopted was controversial even within the US Army. The rifle held 8 rounds loaded together in a metal clip that fed into the action from above. When the last round fired, the clip ejected automatically with that distinctive ping, and the bolt locked, open, ready for a fresh clip. Some ordnance officers argued for a detachable box magazine like those used on automatic rifles, which would allow partial reloading. Garand's system meant you couldn't top off the rifle mid-fight without ejecting a partially spent clip, wasting ammunition. But the en-bloc design had advantages that outweighed this limitation. It was simpler mechanically, with fewer parts to break. It kept the rifle's profile lower, making it easier to handle in prone positions. Most importantly, it was faster to manufacture at scale, and soldiers could carry more ammunition in loaded clips than in heavier detachable magazines. 8-round clips could be stored in standard cartridge belts designed for the Springfield rifle, requiring minimal changes to existing equipment. The US Army adopted the M1 in 1936, but production didn't reach significant scale until 1940. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company manufactured the rifle, with production eventually expanding to include contractor-built weapons from companies like International Harvester. By 1941, production exceeded 100,000 rifles per year. By 1943, American factories were producing over 200,000 M1 Garands monthly. The rifle that entered mass production weighed 4.3 kilograms empty, fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge at a muzzle velocity of 853 meters per second, and had an effective range of 500 meters. But its real advantage wasn't accuracy or range, it was sustained rate of fire. A trained soldier with an M1 could fire all 8 rounds in under 7 seconds, reload in 3 seconds, and resume firing. That meant an M1-equipped rifleman could put 40 accurate rounds downrange in under a minute. A German soldier with a Kar-98K, working the bolt action as fast as physically possible while maintaining aimed fire, could fire perhaps 15 to 20 rounds in the same period. The American had 2 to 3 times the firepower. This disparity became doctrine-breaking when multiplied across an entire infantry squad. German soldiers first encountered the M1 Garand in significant numbers during the North Africa campaign, in late 1942 and early 1943. Initial after-action reports from Wehrmacht units fighting around Kasserine Pass and later at Tunis noted American infantry firepower with a mix of respect and confusion. German tactical assessments assumed that American squads would be armed primarily with bolt-action rifles, supplemented by one or two automatic weapons, mirroring German squad composition. Instead, they faced squads where every rifleman could deliver semi-automatic fire. Feldwebel Ernst Becker of the 10th Panzer Division wrote in a February 1943 letter to his brother that engaging American infantry felt like fighting an enemy armed entirely with light machine guns. The volume of fire American squads generated seemed disproportionate to their actual numbers. German machine gun crews, accustomed to being the primary source of sustained fire in their units, found themselves suppressed by American rifle fire alone. These early encounters in North Africa didn't generate the visceral hatred that would develop later. The terrain was open. Engagements often occurred at longer ranges where the Kar-98K's accuracy remained relevant, and American troops were still learning combined arms coordination. German veterans from the Afrika Korps respected the M1 but didn't fear it the way they feared Soviet artillery or British armour. That changed in Sicily and Italy. The terrain shifted to close quarters, fighting in towns, mountains, and dense vegetation, where engagement distances collapsed to ranges measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. German defensive positions that had worked against British and Commonwealth forces armed with bolt-action Lee Enfields found themselves overwhelmed by American rifle fire. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt defended Monte Cassino with the 1st Parachute Division in February 1944. His position, a reinforced stone building overlooking a key approach, had excellent fields of fire and could engage attackers at 300 meters. German doctrine assumed that well-positioned riflemen and machine gunners could break up assaults through accurate fire, forcing attackers to take cover and lose momentum. When American infantry from the 34th Infantry Division assaulted his position, Schmidt's squad fired disciplined volleys at the advancing troops. Americans went to ground as expected, seeking cover behind rocks and in shell craters. But then, instead of being pinned, they began returning fire with an intensity that shocked the German defenders. Every American rifleman fired as rapidly as the squad's Browning automatic rifle, filling the air with bullets that chipped stone, sparked off metal, and forced the Germans to keep their heads down. Schmidt's squad couldn't maintain aimed fire under that volume of incoming rounds. Their machine gunner, a veteran of the Eastern Front, shouted that it felt like suppressing fire from an entire enemy platoon, but it was just a single American squad. When Schmidt tried to return fire, chambering around and aiming, bullets struck the stone inches from his face, forcing him back into cover. By the time he worked his bolt and prepared to fire again, another burst of M1 fire pinned him. The assault succeeded because German defenders couldn't effectively return fire. They spent most of the engagement behind cover, waiting for gaps in American fire that never came. Schmidt survived and retreated with his unit, but the experience left him rattled. In a letter to his wife, dated March 1944, he wrote that fighting Americans felt fundamentally different from fighting the British. The Americans, he said, didn't fight fairly. They didn't respect the infantry duel of marksmanship and fire discipline. They simply drowned you in bullets until you couldn't shoot back. That phrase, drowned in bullets, appeared repeatedly in German accounts from Italy. It wasn't about American marksmanship, which German soldiers generally considered mediocre compared to Wehrmacht standards. It was about the psychological impact of being under continuous fire from multiple sources simultaneously. A German squad, armed with Kar-98K rifles and a single MG-42 machine gun, had one source of sustained automatic fire. An American squad with M1 Garands, a BAR, and possibly a Thompson submachine gun, had 10 sources of rapid semi-automatic or automatic fire. This firepower disparity created tactical problems German doctrine couldn't easily solve. Standard Wehrmacht infantry tactics emphasized fire and maneuver. One element fires to suppress the enemy while another element maneuvers to flank. This worked when both sides had similar firepower density, but against American units, German suppressive fire from bolt-action rifles often proved inadequate to keep American heads down, while American suppressive fire was overwhelming enough to prevent German maneuver elements from advancing. Normandy, in June 1944, brought the hatred to full intensity. The bocage country of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows, sunken roads, and limited visibility, created the perfect environment for close-range infantry combat, where the M1's advantages were maximized and the Kar-98K's range advantage was negated. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber commanded a platoon from the 352nd Infantry Division during the initial days following D-Day. His after-action report, preserved in German military archives, provides a detailed account of engaging American paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église on June 7th. Weber's platoon, occupying prepared defensive positions along a hedgerow, had clear fields of fire across a small pasture approximately 80 meters wide. When American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division advanced across that field, Weber ordered his men to open fire at 120 meters. The German riflemen, all experienced soldiers, began delivering aimed fire. Several Americans fell in the initial volley. The rest went to ground, exactly as German doctrine predicted. Weber expected the attack to stall, giving his machine gun crews time to reposition and enfilade the pinned Americans. Instead, the Americans immediately began returning fire with what Weber described as impossible intensity. Every American soldier fired as rapidly as possible, not aimed precision shots, but a continuous stream of bullets that turned the hedgerow into a death trap. Weber watched 3 of his men killed in the first 30 seconds, struck while attempting to work their bolt actions and fire back. The machine gun crew couldn't maintain sustained fire because M1 rounds kept striking their position, forcing them to duck. Weber ordered his platoon to fall back to the second hedgerow, approximately 60 meters to their rear. The withdrawal became a rout. Men sprinted across open ground while American fire followed them, dropping 2 more soldiers before the survivors reached cover. In less than 5 minutes, Weber's platoon had lost 5 men killed and 3 wounded, without inflicting significant casualties on the attackers after the initial volley. What enraged Weber wasn't that they'd lost the engagement, it was that they'd lost despite superior positioning, superior marksmanship training, and numerical parity. The Americans had won through sheer firepower, making it impossible for German soldiers to fight back effectively. Weber's report concluded with a bitter assessment. The American semi-automatic rifle negates our advantage in training and fire discipline. We cannot win rifle duels against an enemy who doesn't need to pause between shots. That assessment spread through Wehrmacht units in Normandy with remarkable speed. Veterans warned replacements that engaging American infantry at close range was suicidal unless you had overwhelming machine gun support. Squad leaders adapted tactics, emphasizing the importance of MG-42 machine guns as the primary infantry weapon because it was the only German squad-level weapon that could match American rifle fire volume. But this tactical shift created its own problems. German infantry doctrine had always emphasized the rifle as the primary weapon, with machine guns providing supporting fire. Now, squads became dependent on their machine gunners, and when American fire killed or wounded the MG-42 gunner, the entire squad's combat effectiveness collapsed. German riflemen with Kar-98Ks found themselves unable to provide covering fire adequate to allow the machine gun crew to relocate or for wounded gunners to be replaced. Unteroffizier Karl Brenner, a squad leader in the 12th SS Panzer Division, wrote in his diary in July 1944 about watching his machine gunner killed during a firefight near Caen. The moment the MG-42 went silent, American rifle fire intensified, pinning his remaining riflemen. Brenner tried to organize suppressive fire so someone could reach the machine gun, but working the bolt action while under fire from M1 Garands proved nearly impossible. His men would rise slightly to aim, fire 1 shot, duck to work the bolt, rise again only to be met with a fresh burst of American fire that drove them back into cover. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but Brenner's squad fired fewer than 40 rounds total, while under what he estimated was continuous fire from at least 6 American rifles. His squad eventually withdrew, abandoning the MG-42 and its gunner's body. Brenner's diary entry ended with a simple statement: "We cannot fight this way. We need automatic rifles, or we will all die." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That desperation echoed through official channels. Battalion and regimental commanders from Normandy sent increasingly urgent requests to Wehrmacht ordnance offices for semi-automatic rifles, any design, in any quantity. The requests were denied. Germany had experimented with semi-automatic rifle designs throughout the 1930s, including the Gewehr 41 and later the improved Gewehr 43, but production numbers never reached scale. By mid-1944, German industry was prioritizing machine guns, Panzerfausts, and other weapons considered more critical than replacing the Kar-98K. The official response to field complaints was that German soldiers were superior marksmen and didn't need American-style automatic rifles. This response infuriated frontline troops who knew the reality. Marksmanship didn't matter when you couldn't raise your head to aim. The institutional refusal to acknowledge the M1's tactical advantage became another source of resentment, this time directed at German leadership. Hatred for the M1 Garand among German soldiers took several distinct forms, each rooted in different tactical and psychological realities. The first and most visceral was the hatred born from helplessness. German infantrymen, trained to believe they were the world's finest individual soldiers, found themselves unable to effectively fight back against American riflemen. This wasn't about courage or skill. It was about being mechanically outmatched. Gefreiter Otto Klein described this feeling in a 1978 interview. Klein fought through Normandy, the Hürtgen Forest, and the Battle of the Bulge with the 276th Volksgrenadier Division. He said that facing Americans with M1 Garands felt like bringing a sword to a gunfight. You might be more skilled, better trained, braver even, but when your opponent could fire 8 times for every one of your shots, skill didn't matter. He described watching American soldiers fire carelessly, not aiming carefully, just pointing in the general direction, pulling the trigger repeatedly, and somehow that was more effective than German aimed fire. What Klein called carelessness was actually American fire doctrine adapted to the M1's capabilities. US Army training emphasized rapid fire and fire superiority rather than individual marksmanship. American squad tactics assumed that high volumes of semi-automatic fire would suppress enemy positions, allowing maneuver elements to flank and destroy. The doctrine explicitly stated that it was better to fire 10 rounds quickly and hit twice than to fire 2 carefully aimed rounds in the same period. This approach horrified German military professionals trained in Prussian traditions of fire, discipline, and precision. To them, American tactics represented wastefulness and lack of proper military discipline. But the results spoke for themselves. American squads consistently won firefights against German units of equal or even superior size when both were armed with standard infantry weapons. The second form of hatred emerged from the tactical trap the M1's ping sound created. That distinctive metallic ring when the en-bloc clip ejected became one of the war's most psychologically complex audio signatures. German soldiers were explicitly trained to listen for it and exploit the supposed vulnerability it represented. Training manuals from late 1943 onward included specific instructions. When you hear the characteristic clip ejection sound, the enemy rifleman is empty and reloading. This is your opportunity to advance or fire without receiving return fire. The doctrine made perfect sense on paper. A soldier reloading is vulnerable. Exploiting that vulnerability is basic infantry tactics. But American units quickly learned that the ping could be weaponized. The simplest counter tactic involved buddy teams, where riflemen staggered their reloads. When one soldier's clip ejected, his partner maintained suppressive fire, covering the 3 seconds needed to load a fresh clip. Any German soldier who tried to exploit the ping found himself immediately engaged by the second rifleman. More sophisticated American units deliberately used the sound as bait. A rifleman would fire his last rounds, allowing the clip to eject with its audible ping, then immediately take cover while his squad mates waited. German soldiers, following their training, would often reveal their positions by rising to fire or attempting to advance, only to be engaged by Americans who'd been waiting for exactly that response. Feldwebel Hermann Bauer, of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, fell victim to this tactic near Saint-Lô in July 1944. His squad heard the distinctive ping from an American position approximately 50 meters away. Following doctrine, Bauer ordered 2 men to advance while the enemy reloaded. Both soldiers moved from cover and were immediately shot, one fatally, by Americans who'd been covering their reloading comrade. Bauer realized too late that the sound had become a trap, that American infantry had adapted their tactics specifically to counter German training. This psychological warfare aspect of the M1 created a deeper layer of hatred. German soldiers began to distrust their own tactical training. Should they exploit the ping as doctrine demanded and risk walking into a trap, or should they ignore it and miss genuine opportunities? The sound that was supposed to represent American vulnerability instead became a source of anxiety and tactical confusion. Some German veterans described hearing phantom pings during lulls in combat, an auditory hallucination born from stress and hypervigilance. Lieutenant Wolfgang Schneider wrote in a letter home in August 1944 that the ping of the M1 haunted him more than any other sound of war, more than artillery, more than machine gun fire. Those sounds represented impersonal danger, threats from the general environment of combat. But the ping was personal. It represented a specific enemy soldier nearby who'd just fired 8 rounds at you or your men, was now reloading, and would fire 8 more rounds in seconds. It was the sound of American industrial efficiency translated into battlefield lethality. The third form of hatred stemmed from the M1's role in American combined arms tactics. German infantry doctrine emphasized the infantry's primacy on the battlefield, with other arms supporting the infantryman's advance or defense. American doctrine flipped this relationship. US infantry existed primarily to support armor and artillery, fixing enemy positions so that heavier weapons could destroy them. The M1 Garand was optimized for this supporting role. American infantry squads used their M1s to generate suppressive fire that forced German troops into cover, making them vulnerable to artillery and tank fire. The rifle's semi-automatic capability meant that a single American squad could suppress a German platoon long enough for supporting arms to maneuver into position. German soldiers found themselves pinned by rifle fire, unable to retreat or reposition, while American tanks or artillery moved into position to destroy them. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter commanded a company from the 89th Infantry Division during the fighting around Metz in September 1944. His after-action report described a pattern that repeated across multiple engagements. American infantry would advance until making contact, then immediately establish fire superiority using their semi-automatic rifles. German troops would return fire, but found themselves increasingly suppressed as the volume of American fire increased. Within minutes, American artillery would begin ranging in on the German positions, guided by forward observers who could work safely, because American rifle fire kept German soldiers from engaging them. Richter noted that his men couldn't maneuver to avoid the artillery because American rifle fire made movement suicidal. They couldn't effectively suppress the American infantry because their bolt-action rifles couldn't generate enough fire volume. They couldn't retreat because that required exposing themselves to cross open ground under fire. The M1 Garand, Richter concluded, wasn't just a rifle. It was the foundation of an entire tactical system designed to trap and destroy German infantry. This systemic advantage proved more demoralizing than any individual weapon characteristic. German soldiers could understand losing to superior tanks or overwhelming artillery. Those were matters of industrial capacity and resource allocation. But losing infantry engagements because the enemy's basic rifle was simply better challenged German military identity at its core. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on infantry excellence, on the individual German soldier's superiority over any opponent. The M1 Garand demonstrated that firepower could overcome training, that industrial design could beat individual skill. Gefreiter Paul Zimmermann, captured during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, told American interrogators that German soldiers feared two things above all else: American artillery and American rifles. Artillery could kill you without warning, without any chance to fight back. But at least that was impersonal. The M1 Garand killed your ability to fight back, which was somehow worse. You could see the enemy, you could aim at him, but you couldn't effectively engage because by the time you worked your bolt and prepared your second shot, he'd already fired 3 more times. The psychological weight of this mechanical inferiority accumulated over time. Soldiers who survived multiple engagements against American infantry developed a fatalistic attitude. Some German veterans described feeling that firefights against Americans were predetermined, that individual courage or skill couldn't change the outcome when the enemy could simply shoot faster. This fatalism manifested in higher surrender rates when German units fought Americans compared to Soviet forces, not because Americans were more intimidating, but because fighting them felt futile in a way that fighting the Soviets didn't. The fourth, and perhaps most insidious form of hatred came from what the M1 Garand represented symbolically: American industrial and material superiority. Every German soldier who faced M1-equipped American infantry understood that behind those rifles stood factories producing thousands of them per day, an economy that could equip millions of soldiers with semi-automatic weapons while Germany still issued bolt actions to most troops. The M1 became physical evidence of the resource gap that German propaganda tried to deny. Nazi ideology emphasized German technical and racial superiority, claiming that German engineering and soldier quality would overcome Allied material advantages. But there was nothing technically superior about a bolt-action rifle when the enemy carried semi-automatics. The Kar-98K was an excellent weapon, probably the finest bolt-action military rifle ever made, but it was still a bolt-action, still mechanically inferior to the M1's semi-automatic action. Feldwebel Ernst Koch, wounded and captured near Aachen in October 1944, examined captured M1 Garands while recovering in an American field hospital. He later told a German military historian that what struck him most wasn't the rifle's mechanical sophistication, though it was impressive, but rather its manufacturing quality. The M1 showed machine marks from mass production, utilitarian finishing, nothing like the careful hand-fitting and polishing of German weapons. Yet, it worked flawlessly. Americans had built a semi-automatic rifle that was cheaper and faster to produce than the Kar-98K while being mechanically superior. Koch said this realization made him understand that Germany had already lost the war. If America could mass-produce complex semi-automatic rifles with the same ease that Germany produced simple bolt actions, then the material balance was so lopsided that no amount of German fighting spirit could compensate. The M1 Garand wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that American industrial civilization had achieved something Germany couldn't match: the ability to make sophisticated technology cheaply and abundantly. This symbolic dimension explains why German hatred of the M1 was qualitatively different from their attitude toward other American weapons. German soldiers respected the Sherman tank, but didn't hate it. They could destroy Shermans with their own superior armor. They feared American artillery, but recognized it as an extension of American material superiority in general. But the M1 Garand was different. It was an individual infantry weapon, the most personal tool of war, and it was better than what German soldiers carried. That made the inferiority personal. German attempts to counter the M1's advantages took several forms, none particularly successful. At the tactical level, German units increasingly emphasized their MG-42 machine guns as the primary infantry weapon, relegating riflemen to supporting roles. Squad tactics evolved to protect machine gun crews at all costs, with riflemen serving primarily as ammunition carriers and security rather than as primary combatants. This adaptation acknowledged American firepower superiority but created its own vulnerabilities. When American fire killed or disabled the machine gunner, German squad effectiveness collapsed dramatically. Some German units attempted to capture M1 Garands for their own use. American rifles appeared in German hands with increasing frequency from mid-1944 onward, Soldiers who acquired M1s through capture or battlefield recovery often kept them despite regulations requiring enemy weapons to be turned over to intelligence officers. The rifle's superiority was so obvious that even the risk of being mistaken for an American by other German units seemed worthwhile to some soldiers. Obergefreiter Ludwig Brandt carried a captured M1 through the Hürtgen forest, fighting in November 1944. He'd taken it from a dead American soldier after a firefight near Schmidt. Brandt later described the experience as transformative. For the first time, he could engage American infantry on equal terms. When Americans fired at his position, he could return fire without the vulnerable pause required to work a bolt action. He said it felt like fighting with both hands instead of one. But Brandt's experience was exceptional. Most German soldiers never had access to captured M1s, and those who did often struggled to obtain ammunition. The M1 fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, which was incompatible with standard German ammunition. Soldiers with captured American rifles depended on scavenged American ammunition, which was rarely abundant enough to sustain prolonged fighting. Some soldiers carried both a Kar-98K and a captured M1, using the American rifle until ammunition ran out, then reverting to their German weapon. The German military's institutional response to the M1 threat was the Gewehr 43, a semi-automatic rifle that entered production in 1943. The G43 used a gas-operated action similar in principle to the M1's, fired the 7.92mm Mauser cartridge, and fed from a 10-round detachable magazine. On paper, it matched or exceeded the M1's capabilities. In practice, the G43 suffered from chronic reliability problems, rough manufacturing that led to frequent stoppages, and production numbers that never approached the scale needed to re-equip German infantry. By war's end, Germany had produced approximately 400,000 G43 rifles compared to over 4 million M1 Garands manufactured by the United States. Even if the G43 had been perfectly reliable, which it wasn't, the production gap was insurmountable. Most German soldiers fought the entire war with Kar-98K, bolt actions, knowing that their American opponents carried superior weapons but unable to do anything about it. This knowledge created a profound bitterness among German veterans. They hadn't lost because they were cowards or poor soldiers. They'd lost because they'd been sent to fight a materially and industrially superior enemy with inadequate equipment. The M1 Garand became the symbol of that inadequacy, the daily reminder that German leadership had committed them to a war they couldn't win. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the final bitter demonstration of the M1's tactical superiority. German forces, making their last major offensive in the West, attacked American positions with the advantage of surprise, numerical superiority in the opening days, and elite units including SS divisions. Yet even under these favorable conditions, German infantry found themselves stymied by American rifle fire at the small unit level. At Elsenborn Ridge, American infantry from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held defensive positions against repeated German assaults. The battle devolved into close-range firefights in wooded terrain and small villages where the M1's advantages were maximized. Volksgrenadier and SS units advanced with typical German tactical proficiency, using terrain and fire and movement tactics, but repeatedly found themselves unable to close with American positions because of the sheer volume of rifle fire they faced. Sturmbannführer Ernst Krag of the 12th SS Panzer Division filed an after-action report following his unit's failed assault on Krinkelt-Roscherath on December 17th. His battalion attacked with over 600 men supported by armour. They faced elements of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, numbering perhaps 300 defenders. Standard tactical calculations suggested the attack should have succeeded quickly. Instead, it stalled in house-to-house fighting, where American infantry, firing from prepared positions, generated enough firepower to halt German advances repeatedly. Krag's report noted that his men couldn't suppress American positions long enough to allow assault teams to close. Every time a German squad attempted to advance, American rifle fire from multiple positions would drive them into cover. His MG-42 crews tried to provide covering fire, but American M1 fire was accurate enough to force machine gunners to keep their heads down. The battle lasted 2 days, and when Cragg's battalion finally withdrew, he'd lost over 350 men killed and wounded. American casualties were lighter, and they still held their positions. Cragg wrote that his soldiers had fought with their typical courage and skill, that the failure wasn't due to poor tactics or morale problems. The Americans, he concluded, simply possessed a firepower advantage at the squad and platoon level that German doctrine couldn't overcome. He specifically mentioned the M1 Garand as the foundation of American defensive success, noting that if American infantry had been armed with bolt-action rifles, his assault would likely have succeeded. Similar patterns played out across the Bulge fighting. German units that achieved local numerical superiority still found themselves stalemated by American small unit firepower. The M1 Garand, combined with American artillery support, created defensive positions that were extraordinarily difficult to overrun without taking catastrophic casualties. By late December, as the German offensive collapsed and American forces counterattacked, the tactical balance shifted decisively in favor of American infantry. The hatred German soldiers felt for the M1 Garand reached its peak during the final months of the war. As Germany collapsed and increasingly undertrained Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth filled depleted Wehrmacht ranks, the disparity between German bolt actions and American semi-automatics became even more pronounced. Veteran German soldiers, the men who'd learned to survive against M1-equipped Americans through hard experience, were increasingly rare. New soldiers, teenagers, and old men with minimal training faced American infantry and were slaughtered. Gefreiter Hans Weber, 16 years old, was drafted into the Volkssturm in February 1945 and sent to defend the Rhine with approximately 2 weeks of training. His unit, a hodgepodge of old men and boys armed with an assortment of obsolete weapons, faced elements of the 9th Infantry Division near Remagen in March. Weber survived the engagement by surrendering immediately when American infantry overran his position. He later described watching older Volkssturm members try to return fire against American M1s with their Kar-9 8K rifles and being cut down before they could chamber their second rounds. Weber said the engagement lasted perhaps 15 minutes from first contact to his capture. In that time, his company of approximately 80 men suffered over 50 casualties. American losses were minimal. Weber realized that he and his fellow Volkssturm soldiers weren't really soldiers at all. They were sacrifices, sent to delay Americans who had every material and tactical advantage. The M1 Garand, in Weber's memory, represented the instrument of that slaughter, the weapon that made German resistance not just futile but almost farcical. This final phase of the war transformed the hatred of the M1 from a professional soldier's resentment of superior enemy equipment into something darker, the bitter recognition of total defeat. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers marched into captivity, having spent the war mechanically outmatched by American infantry rifles. For soldiers who'd built their identity around German military superiority, this reality was difficult to process. Post-war interviews with German veterans reveal complex attitudes toward the M1 Garand. Most acknowledged its superiority over the Kar-9 8K, though some insisted that with equal weapons, German soldiers would have prevailed due to superior training and tactics. Others argued that the M1 represented American reliance on material superiority rather than true military skill, that Americans needed semi-automatic rifles because they weren't good enough soldiers to succeed with bolt actions. These rationalizations served a psychological purpose. Admitting that American infantry simply had better rifles was easier than admitting that American military doctrine, training, and industrial systems were comprehensively superior. The M1 could be dismissed as an example of American material excess, of using expensive semi-automatic rifles where simpler bolt actions would have sufficed. This framing preserved German military self-respect while acknowledging the obvious reality that the M1 had been the better weapon. But beneath these rationalizations, many German veterans harbored a grudging respect for the M1 Garand. They'd faced it in combat, watched it kill their comrades, felt the psychological weight of being outgunned in the most literal sense. Some, like Werner Kraus from the opening of this story, admitted that the M1 had taught them that American military competence was greater than German propaganda had suggested. The rifle that they'd hated had also, in its way, earned their respect. The technical analysis that occurred after the war confirmed what German soldiers had learned through bitter experience. American and British weapons testing facilities conducted comprehensive comparisons between the M1 Garand and various German rifles. The tests quantified what infantrymen had known intuitively. The M1 provided approximately 2 to 3 times the sustained rate of accurate fire compared to the Kar-98K. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, tests in 1946 showed that an average infantryman could fire 30 to 40 aimed rounds per minute with an M1 Garand compared to 15 aimed rounds per minute with a Kar-98K. This difference wasn't just theoretical, it translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. American infantry squads could generate more suppressive fire, could engage more targets simultaneously, and could maintain fire superiority for longer periods than German units of equivalent size. The tests also examined reliability under adverse conditions. Both rifles proved highly reliable, but the M1's gas operation system was somewhat more sensitive to dirt and fouling than the Kar-98K's simple bolt action. However, the M1's maintenance requirements were well within acceptable parameters for field use, and American soldiers reported high satisfaction with the rifle's reliability throughout the war. What the technical tests couldn't measure was the psychological impact. Numbers could quantify rate of fire and accuracy, but they couldn't capture what it felt like to be a German soldier working a bolt action while under fire from multiple M1 Garands. They couldn't measure the accumulated stress of knowing that every firefight began with a fundamental disadvantage, that your rifle required you to break your sight picture and work a bolt between every shot, while the enemy could fire as fast as he could pull the trigger. German veterans interviewed decades after the war consistently emphasized this psychological dimension. The hatred they'd felt for the M1 wasn't primarily about casualties or tactical defeats, though those mattered. It was about the feeling of helplessness, of being mechanically outmatched in the most personal kind of combat. One veteran, speaking anonymously in a 1983 oral history project, said that hearing the rapid bang 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 of multiple M1s firing simultaneously still gave him nightmares 40 years after the war ended. The M1 Garand continued in American service long after World War II ended. US forces carried it through Korea, where it proved equally effective against Chinese and North Korean infantry. The rifle's semi-automatic capability provided American soldiers with the same firepower advantages that had served them so well against German infantry. The weapon remained standard issue through the 1950s, only being replaced by the M14 rifle in 1957. Even then, the M1's design influenced its successor. The M14 was essentially an updated M1 with a 20-round detachable magazine and selective fire capability, proving that the fundamental design philosophy of the Garand remained sound. Many M1s continued in reserve and training use through the 1960s, meaning the rifle saw nearly 30 years of frontline service, an extraordinary longevity for any military weapon. The legacy of the M1 Garand extends beyond its service life. It represented a fundamental shift in military thinking about infantry weapons. Before the M1, military establishments worldwide assumed that semi-automatic rifles were either too expensive, too complex, or too unreliable for standard infantry issue. The M1 proved that industrial nations could mass-produce reliable semi-automatic rifles and fundamentally change infantry combat. Post-war military rifle development globally moved towards semi-automatic and eventually selective fire weapons. The Soviet SKS, the Belgian FN-FAL, the German G3, and eventually the American M16 all traced their conceptual lineage back to the realization that infantry firepower mattered more than individual marksmanship in modern combat. The M1 Garand had demonstrated this principle conclusively, written in the blood of German soldiers who'd learned it the hard way. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.